becomes fascinating about this is I'm going to be presenting some concepts to you. I am giving you permission to disagree with me. You may not see it from my perspective. And that's, you're welcome to not see it from my perspective. You'll be wrong, but you're welcome to disagree. And, I guess I should point this out. You'll never forget the spelling on my last name. If you're French, it comes out Theriot. One of the things that fascinates me, not just about our church or our faith tradition, but many faith traditions seem to struggle with a very similar, if not the same concept when it comes to sexual sin. They tend to dichotomize it. It's either you have sexual sin or sexual temptations in your life, or you don't. And there doesn't seem to be this thing that I will call a spectrum of sexual sin. Now, with virtually every other sin, I would suggest and argue that there does seem to be a spectrum. There are big lies, little lies. There's big sins, little sins, and everything in between. But when it comes to sexual sin, I think we struggle when it comes to putting them on a spectrum. And yet, when it comes to shame and guilt and caring for ourselves, I think we need to conceptualize it a little differently. So when you think about sexual sin on this spectrum, over here, I'll call these thoughts. I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands with reference to how many of you have ever had an inappropriate sexual thought. But I would guess that the majority of you have struggled with that. And the ones who haven't struggled with it are in denial. I hope you'll get used to my sense of humor after a while. Another thing I'll kind of alert you to is that I tend to overgeneralize. And I'll use terms like men and women. And that doesn't mean that women don't have or do have certain things, or that men don't or do have certain things. But there is a tendency for men and women to conceptualize sexual things and sexual sin a little differently. And I'm not going to get into that too much today, other than just to say, over here we have sexual thoughts. Now, and again, this is Kevin, chapter 14, verses 27 through 54, when it comes to my belief with reference to how to stratify, how to put on this spectrum sexual sin. And I'll try and help you understand why I conceptualize it this way. The next level of sexual sin is what we'll call masturbation. I list that next because now you're typically chaining a thought with a behavior. Okay? The next level of sin is what I would call pornography. Why? Because these two only involve you. Okay? Unless you're sharing your sexual thoughts or masturbating with someone else, then it falls into a different realm. Okay, but in my definition, these two only involve you. Once you bring in pornography, now you're indirectly involving another person in your sin. Okay? If there were no market for pornography, there would be no pornography. Money drives the pornographic industry, and I could spend an entire hour, I could spend a day on that whole concept and how evil it is. But the next level of sin is what we'll call sexual touching of another person. I think they still call it petting, but to me that always involved a dog or a cat. It just didn't fit for me. So I call it sexual touching of another person. And I'm glad we can laugh, okay? I try and infuse a little humor into this extremely sensitive topic. So when you laugh, you're complimenting me, thank you. It's kind of like an applause. But this is worse because now you are directly involving another person in your sexual sin. After that, we get into intercourse. And I hope it's obvious why that's worse than sexual touching of another person, because now that's a much more intimate, emotional experience with that individual that should be reserved for the marital couple, okay? Not that that shouldn't be too, but definitely that, okay? The next level of sexual sin, I should go like this, that we get into, because here, you're also risking bringing into this world another innocent human being. Only Jesus was conceived, and we could argue this point, but everybody else here in this room was conceived through sexual intercourse. I hope that comes as no surprise to anyone. No intercourse, no pregnancy. It's that simple, okay? But once you get involved in sexual intercourse, then you risk bringing another human being into this world in a less advantageous situation. And then, of course, the sins get bigger. In my humble opinion, abortion is the taking of that life. That's worse than having intercourse, okay? And I will not curl your hair with what goes way out here. But believe me, it gets even worse when it comes to sexual sin. I don't care where you are on this spectrum. Your goal is to move that direction. Your goal is to move that way, okay? Now, in case none of you have noticed, I'm old. I'm not sure I wanted the laughter at that. My goal is to move that direction. You may look at me, Kevin the PhD, old guy, all the knowledge, all the understanding, and say, well, there stands before me a man without sin. I wish I could say that. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we continue to go on. But here, I would suggest another concept to you. I didn't create this thing in my mind that causes me to have a profound propensity toward committing sexual sin. God did that to me. I can hardly wait to die. That's not suicidal ideation. But I can hardly wait to die and sit down with him and say, why did you tweak my brain that way? Because he did do that. Now, that doesn't mean that I might not have done some things to make it even worse. My goal is to not make it worse, but to push it that direction. Now, so many return missionaries that I've talked to over the course of my career, they're out on their missions, they come home and they say, I was doing so good during my mission, and now I'm back home and I'm right back into the struggles I had before my mission. And I look at them and I go, well, why do you think that's the case? We have a word. This is really a word, okay? It'll tell you it's not a word on spell check, but you can look it up. Biopsychosocial. That word means that in virtually all human behavior, there is a biological, psychological, sociocultural, and spiritual component. I don't know why I write it up on the board. You can't read it. I can hardly read it myself. But that's why I got a doctoral degree. So that I could tell my mother my handwriting fit my degree. Okay? Once you're a doctor, then you can write any way you want, get away with it. But that's a laughter one. Thanks. Sounded like a laugh track, though. The biological, Dan was getting into this in some of his presentation, that what we call the midbrain, or that survival brain, okay? That is obviously a part of our brain that does give us commands. There are all kinds of chemical things that go on when it's giving us those commands, especially when we eat all 5 cookies, okay? There's a dopamine rush, there's an adrenaline rush, there's serotonin going on. When we talk about sexual things, we throw in oxytocin. And I'm not a neurologist, but again, I would point out to you that sexual sin has a lot to do with biological stuff. Psychological, I break down into 3 specific categories: early life, present life, future life. Early life means there are things that can happen in our childhoods that can leave us very vulnerable to certain types of sin, and one of those would be sexual sin. If you're sexually or physically abused as a child, the propensity for you to act out sexually during your adolescence and young adulthood is much higher than if you weren't physically or sexually abused as a child. Sociocultural has to do with the culture around us. as you saw, or as you heard, I graduated from ASU. You ever walk through ASU campus in the summertime? If you're a male, or even if you're a female, I mean, there's a lot of visual stimulation going on there that borders right on the edge of pornography, at least for an old guy like me. Okay, we could get into, how pornography has evolved today, but I won't go there. Back in the 1800s, when a woman got off a stagecoach and showed her ankle, that was sexually stimulating. Today, if you came into Dan or my office and said, I was sexually stimulated by a woman's ankle, we would call that a fetish. But my point is, culturally, okay, the whole thing of pornography has really gotten, I'll call it, worse. But, again, the culture that we surround ourselves by. I came to ASU, I wanted to get my degree here. It was the most convenient, inexpensive way for me to do that. And so I tolerated what I had to walk through to get to class, and even sit in class. But my point is, all three of these play a role, as well as spiritual. I have 5 children. One of my children decides that she is going to go and get a degree in social work. I tried to talk her out of it. Okay, I tried to talk her out of the whole field of mental health because it will warp your brain. I mean, when I go for my Temple Recommend interview and they say, do you belong to any organization that preaches a doctrine contrary to the church? It's like, I tell them, I'm a dues-paying, card-carrying member of the worst organization that I know. They believe in abortion. They believe in all kinds of things that are contrary to the church. And if they're interviewing me for the first time, they get a little concerned. If they've interviewed me before, they just start to laugh. But my point is that the field of mental health today, I suggest for your thought, you have to be very careful in believing what's coming out from my profession today. In fact, there is a very good chance that at some point in the not too distant future, I will probably lose my license to practice because of my religious beliefs. All you have to do is read the family proclamation and show that to my licensing board and say, and they ask me, Kevin, do you believe in this document and the things that it teaches? And then the scripture runs through my mind, deny me before men and you're toast. And it's like, I can't deny you before men. And again, we're not there yet, but I can see it coming. So be cautious when people like Dan or I, now we're okay, but be cautious when you're listening to these people. I'm one of those people. But I told my daughter, she said, I'm going to go into social work. I said, you have to do 2 things. And I'm coming back to the missionary thing. This is like my segue back. I said, you have to do 2 things if you're going to go into this profession. You have to read your scriptures every day. And you have to pray. Why? Because you're venturing into a world that's going to teach you all kinds of interesting things, and it's going to bring up all kinds of interesting questions. One of the advantages of working for the church is we get to talk with and hear presentations by the brethren. And I still remember Neil Maxwell one time came into us And he said, your degree is your visa into the world, but never forget where your citizenship lies, in the kingdom of God. The missionary, when you go out into the mission, guess what happens? Many of you don't have to guess when it comes to this, but guess what happens to your social media exposure? Does it go up or down?
Down.
Down, significantly down. And not eliminated, but ideally restricted. What are you doing spiritually? Does your scripture study typically go up or down? Up. Does your prayer go up or down?
Up.
What are you focused on 24/7? Serving who? God. Okay. Is it any surprise why you are stronger when you're on your mission in this spectrum of sexual sin? And believe me, when I use the word stronger, I use it very judiciously, because I would never want to lead anyone to believe that it goes away completely. You still have temptations, but for most who have served missions, it goes that direction and typically drops fairly dramatically. Why? Because you have the luxury of focusing a great deal on here. Now, I draw your attention to that because I'm going to be talking about these three primarily. Because, again, in my clinical experience, you need more than just that in this battle. Because you can't be a missionary or live the missionary lifestyle your entire life. You have to earn a living. You have to sit in classes. You have to walk across ASU campus. You have to do all kinds of things to make your way in this world. Not the missionary world, the Gentile world. And it is replete with temptation. But I'm hoping one of the things before I really launch into these three that you're going to realize is that sexual sin is not just a moral failing. That it's much more than just a spiritual or moral failure. That you want to focus on this and strengthening this as much as you can, but at the same time, you also need to pay attention to these three things over here. Let me give you an example. Now, this is just one example. Okay, ADHD. Does anybody know what that stands for?
Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Attention deficit. Now, one of the diagnostic characteristics of ADHD can be either hyperactivity or impulsivity. Or I shouldn't say or. There are several diagnostic criteria, but one of them is impulsivity. Now, ADHD is a biologic thing, okay? If you've ever had ADHD, one of the interventions is medication, and they give you a stimulant, okay? Some form of a stimulant. There are several different brand names out there. The oldest one is Ritalin, okay? It's amphetamine-based. When you give an ADHD person a stimulant, their mind slows down. If you give me an amphetamine-based medication, I'm going to be all over the place. I mean, my brain speeds way up. That's why they sometimes call amphetamine speed. If you're born with this, does that impulsivity strengthen you or weaken you with reference to avoiding sexual sin?
Weekend.
Weakens you. Why did God give you that challenge? And here, when am I done? Here, I use a lot of dumb metaphors. To me, it helps if I can visualize something. I love Dan's presentation, but man, I had to pay attention. And if you gave me a test on his presentation without my notes, I might do okay because I've been meshed in this stuff for 42 years. But if I were you, I would probably not do really well. What's your name?
Colin.
Because Colin's beginning to fall asleep, I'm going to ask him to stand up here next to me. Colin? And 12:35, got it. And because Colin, he looks a little bit younger than me, okay?
Weeks,
Yeah, months maybe. And he seems to be a little better physically fit than I am. A little. Okay.
My wife is right there. Come on.
I see her looking at you. But it's okay if you have those thoughts about your spouse. Okay, that's another thing that happens is you transition into it's okay one day and it's not okay the next. But we'll talk about that in a minute too. Imagine that Colin and I are going to go over here and climb what we now call Piestewa Peak. Okay, Piestewa Peak. Who do you think's going to win? Don't answer the question yet because I'm going to change up the dynamic a little bit. Colin gets a 500-pound pack on his back, and Kevin has a 5-pound pack on his. Now, let's ask your dear wife. Who's going to win?
I'm afraid to answer this.
Thank you. Colin, you can sit down.
Right answer. Correct answer.
And I will do some marriage counseling with you after. I'm going to win. Colin's going to be lucky to keep his footing in the parking lot. He's probably going to drop to his knees and his hands and try and crawl to the trailhead. Kevin, even though I'm just a little bit older and a little bit less in shape, I'm going to skip over to the trailhead. I'm going to get to the top, come down to the bottom, and I'm going to be lucky if Colin's still on his hands and knees in the parking lot and not laying flat with that pack crushing his chest. Now, that's not a fair contest. That's not fair at all, unless we change it up a little bit. If we grade on who got to the top first and back, I'm the winner. And I have the distinct advantage. If, however, we grade on effort and energy expended, I would argue Colin has the distinct advantage. Why? He has to put forth maximum energy just to keep himself from being crushed by the pack. To match his energy, I have to really push hard. I have to literally run up and down that mountain to even get close to what he's doing. I have been counseling for 42 years, and I have been talking with thousands, if not tens of thousands of people at this point in my career. And if there's one thing I'm convinced of, it is that earth life is not fair. It is flat out not fair. People are born, we all have these packs on our backs. The challenge is that they're invisible, sometimes even to us. And yet they all have a different weight in them. And some people are born with biologic challenges. Some people are born into families where it didn't take more than a 70 IQ to figure out that family situation wasn't going to be good for that person. Sociocultural. I mean, I think there might be some distinct advantages to not being born in a first world country today if I want to live the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because in a third world country, you don't have access to a lot of the sociocultural challenges that exist in first world countries. My point is that just like Dan was saying, you need to not compare yourself to anyone else when it comes to any sin, but I'm focused on sexual sin. You need to try and understand what your challenge is, why it exists. Stop seeing it as just a moral failure and start focusing over here. What are the biologic things I can do? If I'm ADHD, I better take my meds, and I shouldn't be surprised if I'm getting on porn sites on my phone when I'm off my med. You should start connecting those dots. If I experienced abuse or neglect in my childhood, maybe I better plug into some self-help books or some groups or individual counseling or something to address that, because sexual acting out is the symptom of that. Sociocultural. My wife has access to every media account I have. She is not my jailer. Okay, she's not responsible for my decision making in this, but I need a friend who can help me. My wife is my helpmate. I love being responsible to her. I love knowing that she can access any media that I'm on, because that strengthens my resolve to move that direction. Now, I hope, and Dan kind of alluded to this, but I'm going to, put a little phrasing with it. Failure is feedback. Don't look at it as defining you. When you fail, when you struggle, when you sin, don't look at it as failure. Look at it as feedback. And it's like the definition of insanity is let's do the same thing over again and expect a different result. I mean, again, here with the spiritual part, okay, depending on what level of sin you commit, and I have my own opinions, I might even share them if you don't quote me, or if you'll turn your tape recorder off during this part. But in my opinion, confession to a priesthood leader is once your sin starts to involve someone other than you, okay? Now that doesn't mean you couldn't confess sexual thoughts to your bishop, But I would suggest if that was a requirement for all of us, there'd be a line outside his door. Half the women and 90% of the men. The other percent were still lying. But my point is that it's not prohibited. I'm just saying it's not required. Once you start involving someone else in your sin, then the church has an obligation to try and protect its good name, and a bishop should then be involved to determine what the church wants to do to try and help you. But I'm saying confession to your bishop is great if it helps, if it works. If it doesn't, guess what? Then you better be saying, okay, that's not working. That's feedback. Now what do I do? And I'm not saying you can't come back to the bishop. I'm saying right now it doesn't seem to be helping, so maybe I want to try some of these other things. One of the things that part of the description of what I wanted to do today, and I don't want to miss out on this, is how do you help someone else? More than likely, you will be helping someone else during your lifetime. You will be helping your spouse, you will be helping your child, you will be helping a close friend as they try and move that direction with their sexual sin. Dan keyed in on a very important concept when it comes to what doesn't work. Shaming that individual or encouraging them to shame theirself is something that not only doesn't work, but it's probably going to magnify the problem. However, and here's where life gets real complicated. If you're the loved one, if you're the spouse of a person who, let's just use an example. Let's say you're the spouse of someone who's struggling with pornography. Their sin is impacting on you. And oftentimes we call that betrayal. They're betraying a trust that they had in you to not engage in sexual sin. Now again, I said, the goal is to move that direction. I'll tell a little story on me. One of my daughters, we were over on the beach in San Diego, and we were having this discussion about one-piece bathing suits, okay? And that as parents, we wanted her to wear a one-piece suit, and of course, she was into anything but a one-piece suit. Well, if you've ever been to San Diego on a crowded day, they usually have this path that the lifeguard trucks go in and out, and then the rest of the beach is totally packed with people on a busy day. So we're getting ready to leave, and of course I've got lawn chairs and everything else that I'm struggling to carry, and my wife's on this side, and my daughter's on this side, and out from the crowd steps this young woman about age 25 in what I can only describe as a one-piece thong, okay? And my daughter turns to me and she says, well, what about that one piece, Dad? And I said, what one piece? And they both hit me in the arm simultaneously. Why? They knew I was lying. I saw that bathing suit. How could you not see that bathing suit? And yet, what did I do? I lied. Why? Good answer. Okay? Very complicated answer. But my point is that even all of us struggle. And we have to remember that we are not only betraying our loved ones, but we also are struggling with God. But I love the way Dan said it. Does God love me in my struggle? One last metaphor. I'm going to go about a minute over with this to illustrate the point. That's Colin. Okay, he's going to climb this mountain. The goal is to get here. What's your goal, Colin?
To get there.
Get to the top. I get to stand. Colin's wife, and I are over here. We're in this little observation booth, and we get to watch. Colin starts out his climb. He gets about right to there the first day. He comes crashing back down as he slips, gets a few bumps and bruises, crawls in his tent. Colin, are you a success?
No.
No. What's your goal?
To get to the
Get to the top.
Yeah.
Next day, same thing. Doesn't even get as high this time, comes crashing down. Day after day, week after week, this keeps happening. Well, there are other people on the mountain, and they're going by, and they're Colin's friends, and they wave and say, "Hey, Colin, how you doing?" And he's going, "Hey." How does Colin feel as this other person's going higher on the mountain?
Like a failure.
Even worse, okay? Now, he's happy for his friend over here who seems to be going higher, and they crawl around the other side and out of sight, and he can't see him. But Colin feels he's a failure. Why? Because he's not up here. But as he continues to try, day after day, week, months, years, at some point, while I have respect for these other people who are higher than him on the mountain, I stand in awe of what he's doing. Why? Because he never gives up. He keeps trying. He keeps over and over and over again. Ideally, if I can see the attempts, and if Colin's wife can see the attempts that he's making, and we both judge him to be sincere and striving to climb that mountain, if we can stand in awe of what he's accomplishing, is God better or worse at recognizing that in us? And I would argue he is so much better. Our goal, never give up. Always battle, even when you're old, like I am. The battle never ceases. God gave men weakness that he might make them strong. And some people interpret that to mean strong in overcoming their weaknesses. I would argue my weaknesses make me strong in being charitable and kind and non-judgmental to you. Just because you have weaknesses in your life, I understand weakness. I struggle with my own. I am able to be so much more charitable and kind, forgiving and loving to you, because that's what I'm hoping to get in return. And I leave you with these thoughts in the name of Jesus Christ.